Welcome, everyone. My name is Emmeline Zhao. I'm Senior Editor for Special Projects for the 74. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan news website specializing in education. We cover education from K-12 to higher ed to the future of work, which is why we're here. To my immediate left is Nathan Martin. He's Director of Global Thought Leadership for Pearson. Haley Schoaf is the VP of Impact for LaunchCode. And Michael Ellison is founder and CEO of CodePath.org. So thank you for being here. We're just going to jump right in because we don't have a whole lot of time. So in what ways? Well, let's talk about kind of what the future of work means first, and in what ways will or must the future of work create greater opportunities for women? Jump right in.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So when I think of future work, I think the impact on all jobs. We look at major openings across the country in healthcare and many other areas, and we just see a gigantic shift with technology affecting all of the skills required for all these roles. I was on a luncheon with one of the largest healthcare providers over in Texas a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about all these openings and talking about skilling programs and ways to get people into their workforce and entry level and beyond. And then I asked them, how quickly are these jobs changing? How quickly are the skills changing? And they're like, oh, don't get me started. Every month there's a new tool, there's a new skill, there's a new, and what they were talking about was digital literacy. And in my mind, I was thinking about this gap, increasing gap between people who have access to these skills and these opportunities that are going to allow them to participate, not just get the job, but also have the upward mobility and maintain the job and have the job security, and the gap between people that end up not having that. So when I'm thinking about future of work, I'm thinking about how jobs are changing, and then I'm also somewhat petrified by how inadequate many of the systems that we have are at creating the millions of people we need in order to fill these open positions in the future.
Yeah, when I think about the future of work, I think a lot about where the bulk of the jobs are going to be in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that can be, in a lot of ways, that leans towards digital skills. So jobs that have mid to high level digital skills and kind of the workforce moving that way, but also just job categories overall. I think there's some very interesting statistics out there about the makeup of where those middle skill, future-oriented jobs are going to be. Only about 29% of the middle skill IT roles that are kind of expanding most rapidly in America are held by women. And then when you actually look in other realms, healthcare IT, advanced manufacturing, things like that, only about 10% of the growing middle skill area jobs are held by women. So I think a big question is thinking about, at all levels of the workforce, how do you both get women into those types of jobs and keep them there? And I think that has to do both with building workplaces that are intentional and also accessible to women, and also working on empowering women themselves to have the confidence and the skills and the sort of global knowledge to move into those jobs and understand where the opportunities are.
So two things. When I think about the future of work, so first, I'm a kid from Mississippi, but I live in London, and so my brain is somewhere in the Midwest, I think, still, so I'm a little jet lagged, I apologize. But when I think about the future of work, we've done a bunch of research around this with Oxford, and sort of and looking at sort of the different trends other than just automation that would sort of impact, changing demographics, people living longer. And when that research pointed to sort of a more positive future, that there's gonna be a lot of disruption, but we have a bit more control in how that future proceeds. And whether that, so that gets to a question of, well, what's it going to look like? If it's open-ended, if it's not necessarily going to mean that automation is going to take all their jobs, what is that future going to look like? And that gets to the question of, will it be good for women? And I have to say, first and foremost, I'm a white man, so I really enjoyed the last session. And so when it comes to a white man thinking about what it means to create opportunity for women, a lot of what I do is listen to the really smart women that I get to work with. There's one in the front here, Anjali Ramachandran, who's with Ada's List. So it gets to a broader point of intent, because algorithms and automation are expressions of intent. And they don't just happen in a vacuum. And so there's been plenty of times throughout history that technology has promised that it's going to make things better for women, it's going to make things better. But in reality, it's actually not happened that way. And so when I think about the future, I think that the future can be positive for women. It can create new opportunities. But I think we're going to have to take a step back, and it's going to be more of a question of just like finding new jobs or skilling people up. It's going to actually be rethinking about how we structure work to make it better for all people.
Michael, you mentioned that you were petrified, and can you guys give some framing as to how dire the situation is right now with gender equity?
I'm happy to get started a little bit. First, I'll actually just share like a personal story. So. CodePass has been doing a lot of training inside of major technology companies, and we're asked by one very large employer to create a program where if you perform well in this 2-month project-based, multiple hours a week, nights and weekends program, then you could go from an individual contributor to management. And the company wanted to have their managers select who they thought would be the best fit across this organization. And this company, by the way, they've won awards for inclusion. And they talked about how they were so proud of all these different initiatives that they had. And they had about a dozen managers from across the company. They have tens of thousands of employees. Select these people who they thought would be a great fit for this opportunity to prove themselves for leadership. And then what ended up happening is the managers ended up selecting 80% men for this opportunity. And we were like, okay, great, we think your process is great, but let's try this other alternative. And the alternative was a process where you allowed anyone to raise their hand. You had a blind selection process. And then also, as people were going through this process, you're actually encouraging them. You're trying to build confidence and make more people to not just apply, but persist through this process. We saw, and we've seen this over and over across different technology companies, 60% of the top performers actually ended up being women. And this company didn't think that they had a problem. They didn't think this was an issue. But this was like a very clear signal. And by the way, the people who were handpicked from the managers, most of them were placing towards the bottom of this evaluation, not towards the top, towards the bottom. So we've actually seen from a data-driven standpoint, women tend to be not just underestimated and undervalued, but oftentimes they can be the outliers, but they're not even putting themselves forward because of lack of opportunities and in many cases a confidence of understanding that they really do deserve that chance. So I think I'm going to initially talk about it from that.
Yeah, I think about it, this is a very personal issue to me, and I think about it in terms of my own story actually as well. So I'm someone that came from relative privilege, grew up middle class in a 2-parent household, went to a really good public school in Chicago, and probably when I was in 5th or 6th grade would have been a shoo-in to be like an engineer or a computer programmer. You know, I would lock myself in my bedroom for hours and build Lego robots. But already by the time I hit junior high, I can vividly recall having male friends that were into coding, and they built a little blog that all of our friends would play on. And at the time, thinking that that was something that boys did. And already by the time I was 13, the idea that my male peers were playing with HTML and CSS, and that was not something that was for me, was like deeply ingrained in kind of my socialization. And then, fast forward to me being a sophomore in college, and I, still was interested in tech. I did this science, technology, and international affairs undergrad program, and I wanted to do a concentration in computer science. And I took CS 101, did okay, took CS 102, and I got, I think, like a B- in the class, and I was petrified because I had never gotten anything less than an A my entire life. And I went in to talk to the professor, and I was like, I don't know if I'm good at this, and I'll never forget him telling me that, I think you're a strikingly average computer programmer. You should, think about what your comparative advantages are, and maybe you should, you look like you're a really good writer and communicator. And I quit computer science at that point in my life, and I, went and I did like a management science concentration, and obviously I haven't faulted for that greatly. Like I'm, a nonprofit executive, I've done very well for myself, but it wasn't until about 2 years into working at LaunchCode, which we're a nonprofit organization that provides free computer coding training and apprenticeship placement to people from non-traditional backgrounds. And I would work with women that had gone through our Coder Girl program specifically, and started to see a lot of trends of women, sometimes women that had bachelor's degrees, sometimes women that had master's degrees, and the way they approached and oriented themselves to coding in particular, which is a career path with a high failure cycle, and it requires a lot of risk taking and a lot of thinking outside the box, as opposed to their male peers, many of whom did not have nearly the same credentials, and were just like, oh, of course, I did this program, like, I'm ready for a job. And it only, at that point started to reflect on me. I was like, wow, I was socialized out of tech. I think it says a lot that if somebody like me can have that happen to them without even really noticing or recognizing it, how deep the biases and the problems go. And as I've worked with thousands of men and women and people of all backgrounds at this point in terms of trying to help them break into tech. And I think that gives me the lens of just how scary it is and just how deep it runs in terms of the confidence gap and also just like the socialization gap that has to be overcome to get people into tech.
I have to say, I remember talking to your team 2 years ago and hearing about it, and I emailed my colleagues and just said, my gosh, this is so exciting because you guys don't just provide the coding skills, but it's also the soft skills, things like childcare at times, and that's just such an important thing if you're going to change that culture. And your experience jives with one of the reasons that I guess Emily asked me to come is we do a podcast series called Nevertheless, and it's really trying to provide a platform for some of the less heard voices in tech. And you may see some really beautiful STEM role model posters that are around, and those are things that we've commissioned with this team, with local artists from the country to really try to provide that idea of, if she can see it, she can be it. And what's been really fascinating as we started to grow that platform is the number of women that have come to us and said, I work at a big tech company, and we're always, Pearson's known for being many things, but the number of women that have come and said, I never understood how I ended up in a sales job, but I realized that I was told, to exactly your experience, maybe you're probably not good at this. And we are literally seeing people who are finding their own story. And so, and it's also really important that all their stories don't look like mine. One of the most exciting things, I think, what's happening in the Middle East, there's a really amazing organization called 23 Code Streak that work with Muslim women in London predominantly, and providing them like a safe space to be able to not just learn the skills, but also learn it in a constructive environment, because so much of coding and those things is about collaboration, it's about teamwork. And so what I'm really fascinated is learning the people that haven't had some of those experiences, who maybe didn't come from privilege, and how we can be a platform to help support that. So that's why we're here. My two colleagues that are right here, that are in the front, we're just going around learning from people like you, because we think it's really important to try to do what we can to help and change the culture.
I want to set this up a little bit more before we get into the solutions, because I know you guys have a lot of thoughts on that. But we can't talk about equity or gender equity without mentioning the wage gap. A lot of studies show, and I know Nathan has some numbers. The studies show that there was a study out of the National Bureau of Economic Research in 2017 that showed that men and women, once they finish school and start work, are more or less in an even playing field. The gap starts to widen about 6 years later when women are in their late 20s, early 30s, predominantly around the age that they're having children, they're starting families, they're moving for their husbands. So how do we address those issues going forward with technology, with a new age of work? Is there something that can be done? And I know that Coder Girl offers childcare, which is a huge thing. So kind of what are those things that really need to happen to seriously close that wage gap?
Yeah, but we wouldn't have to go in order, but I'm happy to chime in anytime. So I think there's a missing opportunity for companies to make a much greater investment in training at specific points in someone's career. Technologies are changing very quickly, and your skills can be out of date when you have left to do whatever type of thing. And I think it's very important for companies to be able to support women to be able to take time off or parental leave in general, but they often are lacking in terms of their assistance with helping women at various levels to actually transition back and hit the ground running. I see on the most training programs, corporate training programs are like 1 to 3 days, full day, or even we're talking about let's learn a new technology, which will typically take months or even years, and you're looking at the default in the industry is like a week-long program, boot camp, whatever you want to call it. That is just not sufficient, and it's not really acceptable. If you value your employees, then you need to be able to provide opportunities for them to take time off and come back and hit the ground running. And then there's additional issues when you're talking about women in leadership positions, and it's challenging because it's very competitive. There's very much of like being in the certain circles and in the room and part of the conversations and working on the projects. But I also think that is important to make sure that you are investing in your employees for the longer haul. And so one thing I'll just add, I think that training and then thinking about it differently, as well as how does technology integrate with that? I think, I'm a fan of in-person courses in general, blended learning. So I would like to see something more of those emotionally connected experiences versus a lot of companies are focused on kind of, bite-sized, like 10 minutes learning here and there.
Yeah, I think two different areas. One is around kind of the education and empowerment of women themselves as it relates to, I think again, kind of harping back to the same point, a lot of women don't see or identify themselves as being affected by these issues, and so it kind of can be the silent killer sometimes.
Wouldn't you say that? Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but wouldn't you say that education should also extend to men?
Definitely, as well. No, and so I think it's both. And I think for women, there's the element that there's studies that show that men will ask for a raise essentially every year, and women never ask. And it's like, so it starts with simple education around those kinds of things. I think it also extends to education around companies as well, in terms of providing that training to their female employees, also just looking at the way company structures are set up, so around things like maternity leave and also paternity leave. So starting to normalize the idea that when a family has a child, men and women take off or take away from work. Thinking about remote work schedules and work schedules that prioritize results as opposed to processes, and so allowing people to work when and how they're effective, especially once they start to have families, that helps to account for some of these things.
I think all those are really good things. I think so it's been interesting because I grew up in the States, but I've been in the UK for the last couple of years, and Pearson, as a UK company, we're required to report on our gender pay gap, and so we actually can try to show where we're falling short and where we need to do more work, and it's been really illustrative to sort of see those areas that we need to do better. It's also been interesting in terms of just the normalization of maternity and paternity leave, so that's something that's much more normalized for men to take time off, for women to do it, and it kind of gets to that point of intent that you touched on, and I know it's been really great to see Alexis Ohanian, I can't never say his name right, the guy from Reddit, married to Serena Williams, just some of his efforts to try to normalize that and say, like, actually, what would it take for us to create a better working environment for everyone? And when it comes to the gender pay gap and sort of where women are being left behind, it is about, maybe they take time off for childcare, but it's sort of actually we need to ask ourselves a better question. And there's this Italian theorist that came up with this term that I really love. It's called this term of reproductive labor. And just kind of like let that sit with you. And that's not just the idea of like a woman carrying a child. It's actually all the soft things that we default to having women, unfortunately, like because of the way that society gets structured, carrying society. And that's not something you can just automate out. If women stopped carrying on and doing that, they don't get paid for that most of the time, but society would collapse. And we have to ask ourselves some really important questions for companies. How do we incentivize and encourage and say, actually, you being part of your kid's life, whether you're a man, you're a woman, single mom, parent, it's really good. And I think it's really important for where men as allies. There's a really great journalist, Jackie Luo, or Lowe, L-U-O, and she's compiled just thousands of salaries of people who are in the tech industry who have just said, here's how much I got paid, here's my experience. And for people to be able to see that transparency, it's a powerful disinfectant, because so often what happens, you saw this in the movie industry, where people walk in the room and a woman gets paid X amount, a man gets paid Y amount. And the final thing is just modeling behavior. think it's really great for an executive, we're in a big company, to say you can do this, you can do that. It's not until a mom actually takes time off and drops off of a phone call, which happened with one of my new executives. I gotta go pick up my kids. And to model that behavior for her 140-person team, or for a father to do the same thing, or a single parent, that's when it seeps into the company. And so it is about data, it is about doing those things, but it's also about culture, and culture is as a behavior, as a product as well.
Kind of touching on culture, and when you mentioned earlier about how you were socialized out of tech, I think a lot of this goes back down to education at the fundamental, like elementary level, pre-K, K-12. So what needs to happen in our education system to make sure that kids are set up for success going forward with equity generally?
Yeah, I think you can actually look at like the university education system and then kind of extrapolate that back downwards. So when you think about women in technology education, there's a couple universities that have done a really good job. Harvey-Mudd is one of them, Carnegie Mellon is one of them, that have started to rethink their computer science education around, rather than having programs be highly competitive and weed out oriented, they're much more about exposure and cultivating interest and actually adapting the overall content of their curriculum to make it more friendly for everyone, including women. They've seen retention rates for women in tech skyrocket as a result of that. And I think Accenture did a very interesting study that shows that a lot of those principles extrapolate all the way back down to elementary school, where it's not just, people always talk about getting girls into STEM, exposing girls to STEM, exposure, but it's not just exposure, it's about the content of that exposure and adapting and trying to figure out content that's specifically catered towards girls' interests, themes that girls are interested in, and having that be very fundamental to curriculum from a very young age forward. But I think it's also about kind of encouraging even the way that we talk to young girls. The woman that founded Girls Who Code has a fantastic TED Talk where one of her main lines is, we socialize girls to be perfect and boys to be brave. And that, as early as 5th grade, you can see boys saying things like, my code is broken, and girls saying things like, I'm broken, or like, I'm not good at this. And what we praise young girls for and what we praise young boys for, I think matters a lot and has lifelong impacts that oftentimes aren't recognized as much as they should be.
Yeah, so I actually just think technical education, CS education is generally pretty terrible. K through 12, higher ed, it's worse. So in higher ed, so Harvey-Mudd, for example, I think they're a really great example, but at the same time, then they have such a small number of students, and then 100% of their student body is already technical before they get in there. So they don't have the same challenges as a lot of programs, but I still love them. And as a board member, that's it. Anyways, so they're great. Harvey-Mudd, if you're in the room, you're awesome. There's other schools that do similar programs, but I think one of the important takeaways is there's a multiple pathways approach. Where based on where you are, whether you're expert, have been programming for years and years versus you're seeing it for the first time, they have a different introduction that has different pacing. And I think that is really smart and something we generally don't do in education. But the reason I said that I thought technical education was broken and that is because so you look at K through 12 and we focus a lot on data structures and algorithms. Most colleges and universities, and also K through 12, we have all these math requirements. We're doing things backwards. And software engineers are generally not doing that stuff day to day. They're building mobile applications. And they're thinking about VR, and they're thinking about cybersecurity. And these technologies are not something that you need to go to school for 10 years in order to have exposure to. I think there's a lot of value in computer science, and we recommend both. But if you're trying to find the way that you can make people fall in love with programming, which is super fun. If you build an iOS app, if you're building an iOS application, there's a part of Xcode called Storyboard, which feels kind of like PowerPoint. You're drag and dropping shapes, and you can actually have something on your phone where you're not writing a line of code. And it just seems crazy to me that we're not exposing young people to something that's so creative and that is related to design and product. And I think that's a much better introduction to computer science and programming than simply like, well, if you don't love algorithms, well, I'm sorry, this is what it's all about. Well, that's not actually what it's all about. We have a system designed to make people filter out of computer science, and it disproportionately affects people that, women and underrepresented minorities and people that don't have a lot of mentors and role models and so forth. And then within that, there's a huge opportunity to dramatically increase engagement and attention on every level, I think.
I think we can't treat students like, it's just sort of actually believing that it's not that some are more gifted, some are more suited to things. It takes cultivation, and we don't do a very good job. I was at in the UK, they have something, the British Science Week, where they bring together the celebration of science, and they had a really awesome innovation competition this year where they asked students to think about, people are living longer, what are technologies that could help people live with grace and dignity longer. And what I was really impressed is I got to walk around and see all the students from around the country, just the diversity. You had women in hijabs, you had young men from kind of more of a deprived area, you had actually one group that couldn't even be there because they were in a kind of a juvenile offenders place, but they were able to send their project and present that there. And I talked to the CEO, or the person behind the group, and they basically went out and cultivated those schools. They provided bursaries, they provided grants to help make sure that they felt like, and they provided cultivation and training. And you saw these young women, some of these young women that were in the room, they started the day off nervous about pitching their project. By the end of the day, they were just fired up and they were excited. And I think, that sort of cultivation doesn't happen as much as it should on a systemic level. And the second point is so we need more of that linked to real problem solving and not just kind of in isolation. And the other bit is just, if algorithms are really a state of intent, we need to have safe places for us to think about our intentions. So some of that great conversation we had before we got on stage about stereotype threats, and particularly about white men being scared about talking about race, if we don't teach our young men and our young women about how to have safe and responsible conversations about these things, they don't go away. They show up on the internet. We see it, on some of the nasty things that happen on YouTube or wherever else where these really disgusting, racist, sexist threads are happening. And to the sort of the pipeline problem, if women get brought in, but then they come into an environment, and it happens in STEM fields and research where they're sexually harassed, when there are all these other things, it's about a culture. And if we don't help people who are creating good intentions from the beginning and ask those tough questions, then I don't think we'll solve the problem.
So how does that manifest itself in education?
Can you be more specific? Like how
does that happen, right? We're saying that we need to cultivate this culture.
Mm-hmm.
Does it start with teachers? Does it start with curriculum? Like what has to happen to
I
make that?
have somewhat of a controversial view on this. So I think, and I go to a lot of different events, you all go to a lot of these different events, and I keep seeing this emphasis on teachers, and specifically give teachers more resources, teachers use more technology, and teachers already don't have enough time, and they're not paid enough. And the few teachers who are here are thinking about a million different things that they already wanted to do, that they don't have time to do. So I actually really love the idea of decreasing the number of things that a teacher has to worry about. My organization essentially does that on college campuses right now. We do grading for professors, we do support for the professors, we do homework help. We provide a higher tier of support for students in the classroom, and the professor is able to focus on what they want to focus on to enhance that core experience that is more controlled. So I think that when you're looking at where the incentives of the large population of teachers, you're freeing up time, but then I don't know if people don't like the idea of their aspects that you're taking away from their responsibility, but then that's a way to have better outcomes at scale. And if you were I'm from rural Maine, if you were a teacher in rural Maine and you were trying to figure out how to solve issues in your classroom, wouldn't it be wonderful if you're able to have more consistency across different classrooms, be able to take a playbook that mapped the type of student population and types of challenges that you're looking at? The way that we approach a lot of the, here's a physical binder, here's multiple binders, and now figure out how to implement that with your own use case. I feel like that's more of the Stone Age. And the future, like automation, I feel it's data, it's analytics, it's making education good and bad feel more like product development or software development, where you understand what's happening in the classroom and you're making intelligent data-driven decisions, and you're able to see that across hundreds, thousands of classrooms as opposed to everybody's reinventing the wheel 10,000 times every single year. So the implementation, I think there is a technology solution. I think data is important. I don't want to say empathy isn't important, but I think culture, racism, discrimination, that's pretty hard. That's a pretty hard. If you have a solution for that, then.
No, I was just going to say, I think
have a solution.
No, I don't. But I think it's really important to know that you don't have a solution for it. I think that's one of the things about, I've tried to realize, I grew up in Mississippi, and I had really loving parents who taught me to love people and try to treat them with dignity and respect. But the most important thing, it came up in the previous session where someone says, oh, I don't see color. And it's really important to see color and to recognize that I don't know what it's like to be a young black man in the South and have to fear police officers or whatever else. I don't know what it's like to be a woman going through certain experiences, but just because I don't know that doesn't mean I have to stop there. So I think if we can get away from this, so when it comes to culture, it's about moving away from fear and getting into a dialogue, and that's what one of the things we try to do with the podcast is we don't evangelize tech. But we try to encourage, so parents, when it comes to Snapchat, when it comes to YouTube, can you sit down with your student, or your kids, or your guardians, or whatever, and just say, hey, look, what are you doing this? How do you use this? How's it part of your life? Because parents get scared about screen time, they get scared about coding, they get scared about all these things, and so the more that we can have a dialogue, I have to do this with my parents, because I still have brothers and sisters at home. My dad freaks out because he wakes up at 3 a.m. and my brothers are playing Fortnite in their bedroom, and I'm like, Dad, it's gonna be okay, they're not gonna turn out horrible. So it's about trying to move away from that fear, and that gets, I think, to the classroom where it's not this sort of division, but it's where you can have a dialogue and get involved on that. But that's not an easy answer or a solution.
I do have one easy one, though. And we have been doing this for a long time. Even if you have a majority male environment, put women in leadership positions. And some of the best engineering managers in Silicon Valley at having diverse teams, they previously had bosses who were women. And it's normal for them to think of women in leadership positions. And I want to see that, like, women all over panels. It's not just for the women. The men benefit a lot from just that being normal. So I think that is one thing that does impact culture.
Yeah, and I would say I can talk a little bit about like what we do at LaunchCode in terms of empowering women. It's about empowering and supporting communities and encouraging people to build communities and just building the space to allow women to explore things on their own. So in our programs, we have our LC 101 program, which is our 0 to job ready in tech program. It's open to men and women, but based on a shortage of just women enrollment in our programs overall, we've also developed a program called Coder Girl, which is a relatively similar curriculum, but it's extended over a slightly longer period of time. It meets fewer times a week to accommodate for just like the larger amount of external life commitments that most women have to grapple. We try and help women get support with childcare. And it's taught predominantly by women, predominantly just technologists in the St. Louis community that come in once a week and teach skills to other women over the course of a year. And then those women have work they do in kind of a flipped classroom style model outside of class. And 99.9% of the students in the program are women. And so we serve about 300 women a year with that program, of whom something like 40% are actually making their way into our apprenticeship program within a year and a half. And so we've seen that if you just create the space and start to normalize that experience and get a large group of women led predominantly by women and give them some space and some curriculum to do it. It's not to say that that's a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think there's a lot of conversation around how do we get more women in tech. But I went to an interesting panel yesterday about a similar topic, and they were saying, there's a statistic about, I think, the number of women graduating from CS programs is like 18%. But it's been 18% since like 2006. And so we've been having these we have a lot of conversations about these things, and I think that doesn't always lead to action. And so it's important not to underestimate how challenging these things can be. It's also important not to overestimate it and just provide the space and provide the resources and let women figure it out.
I would just say kind of on that, and I'll give a plug. If you guys want to work with us, we're really excited about it because we want to create space for women. Like, it's actually weird for me to be on stage in regards to some of this work because my friend that's sitting in the front, he and I, we believe our sort of job as the two white men on the team is to get out of the way and be the support and the platform for these awesome women that we get to work with. And so part of it's like, to your point, is like if a woman makes a mistake or fails, it's creating safe places so we can help them succeed. We have illustrators who are earlier in their career, and it's nothing is more empowering than to pay them a fair wage as well. Don't do this stuff for free, and teaching people that there's an expectation that good work is paid for. But creating an environment, whether it's students, helping them develop their own podcast, writing, whatever it might be, we want to create not a safe space in a bad way, we can have constructive conversation, but if something is a mistake, we want them to feel like we're going to be on their team. And so next year, we're working with people around the world, and we're going to basically turn over our podcast to organizations that are in different countries, and we're going to get out of the way, and we're going to try to help them tell their story, because we think Pearson's a big company. We have 25,000 employees. We're all over the world. We could just bombard you guys with information. It wouldn't change your mind. We think it's much more effective, and we believe it's the right thing to do, getting out of the way and trying to be a support. And the only way that happens is if you do it meaningfully, because you can have all the words, but if you don't back it up with actions, it doesn't mean anything. So that's also a request. If y'all want to work with us, we're really excited.
And Haley, just to kind of give a sense of the women that are part of Coder Girl, what's the median age of the women that are in the program?
I don't have an exact number, but I would say generally mid-30s.
So kind of mid-career and with families and things like that.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Coder Girl, LaunchCode's programs overall are about 70% of our students are making less than $30K a year at the time that they start our programs. It's over 50% people that don't have a 4-year college credential, and about 40% people of color. And I think holistically across our program, we're about 37% women in terms of people that get placed into our apprenticeship program. But actually, when you look at the Coder Girl demographics, by and large, the credentials of the people entering the program are noticeably higher than our pool at large, where we're looking at a lot more women that have bachelor's degrees, have master's degrees, oftentimes are making 40, 50, 60K a year, and don't, I guess, look like what some people have come to think of as the typical launch coder, but either they have stopped out of the workforce to have children and they're looking for a pathway back in, or not dissimilar to myself, they have a bachelor's degree, sometimes from a notable institution, but it's in the humanities, and they realize that they've really always loved STEM. And so I think a lot of it is trying to think about all the different avenues from which someone can come to these things and creating space for a number of different people.
So to close out, you guys have probably noticed that the majority of the audience today were women. So how do we get more men like yourselves to join this conversation? And are you guys generally more optimistic or pessimistic that we'll see greater opportunity for women in the future of work?
So I get to wake up each morning and I monitor our Twitter account, and we get to see these role model posters that have gone viral in the last couple months just around the world. And so I wake up and I see students, I see their faces smiling, excited, and those are both men and women. And so in some ways, I am optimistic, because I think if we focus on what's happening with Donald Trump, if I focus on what's happening with some of the things in the UK with Brexit, I will get depressed. But I think we can do this, we can create these positive cultures and environment, and a lot of it is if we learn to listen to people that are smarter than ourselves. So I'm gonna point to her again, Anjali heads up Ada's List, which is a large women in tech group. They're global, they have a bunch of amazing people all over the world that are learning and solving problems. I just want to normalize it where men don't think like you don't need to be woke, you don't need to be anything special, you just need to care about making the world better for everybody, and that shouldn't be a pat on the back type thing, that should be a baseline. So that's, yeah, I'm optimistic, but I'm just also tired of it being seen as something extraordinary it shouldn't be.
So I actually think that the age of automation is going to be the age of women. And I think Girls Who Code and Code.org and other organizations are doing a great job inspiring a lot of women to major in computer science. We have programs across 49 colleges and universities, and we have no trouble attracting lots of women to our programming courses. It's getting easier and easier. There's a lot of women that are there. It's on the inspiration stage, and there's still a lot of challenges to get that to software careers and persistence in those careers. But I'm very optimistic, especially because I think more data means that companies are going to reduce their false negative in their hiring process. And we've seen from experience training inside of companies and doing recruiting for major technology companies that disproportionately affects women and underrepresented minorities who will be undervalued in the evaluation process. So I think with better data, companies are just going to be hiring more and more women because they're going to see that they're awesome. And And as from a male ally standpoint, I think I see my role as when women are there, making sure that we speak up for them. When women are not there, it's even more important that we are saying what's okay and what's not okay to say. And I also see men need to step up to be sponsors and champions, interview women, put them on projects where it leads to promotion opportunities, make sure they're in the room. So many things happen in closed doors and whatnot, and just try to make sure that you're an advocate, whether or not they're there. So that's where it's on that.
Yeah, I would say as it relates to men and trying to talk to men about things that they can do that are tangible, men sponsoring women, I think, in terms of is extremely important in women getting into these leadership positions and making a difference. I think about my own career, and when I first started at LaunchCode, my first boss was a white guy from Middle Missouri who definitely would not classify himself as woke, but he was a huge sponsor and advocate for me. And I think one of the reasons I got fast-tracked to leadership in the organization was because of opportunities that he gave me and opportunities that he gave me to use my voice and be heard, and that had a huge impact on my career. So I think it's about, if you're a man or if you're talking to men about ways that they can advocate for women, just find one woman that you find to be really promising and sponsor her for opportunities. And then once she advances, do that again. If you do that one woman a year for 10 years, that makes a really tangible difference if more men would do that.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you to our panelists. You guys are great.